Imagine choosing to deliberately set a haystack on fire.
Yeah, knowing full well you're going to be arrested for it.
Right, exactly. Just so you can be locked inside a rotting, disease-filled wooden ship.
It sounds completely wild to us now.
It really does. But, in 18th and 19th century Britain, that wasn't a sign of madness. For some people, it was actually a legitimate survival strategy.
Which is just a profound level of desperation. I mean, when a prison cell is fundamentally more appealing than your day-to-day freedom, that tells you everything you need to know about the society you're living in.
It really does. Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking you on a fascinating historical exploration. We really want to cut straight through the myths and, deliver some real aha moments for you.
Oh, absolutely. We've got some incredible stuff to cover.
We do. We have a massive stack of notes here today, all centered around a really comprehensive Wikipedia article simply titled Convicts in Australia.
It's a great source.
Yeah. And our mission today is to shortcut your path to understanding how an 80-year-long penal experiment fundamentally shaped a modern nation. We're going to try to balance the grim realities with these just incredible mechanics of human survival,
Yeah, because it's a history that challenges almost every assumption you might have about crime, punishment, and really how a civilization is actually built from the ground up.
Okay.
We tend to think of national origin stories as these grand philosophical triumphs, right? Well, but this is the absolute inverse of that.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can really understand who was actually sent to Australia, we have to understand why Great Britain desperately needed a giant island prison in the first place.
Exactly. You have to look at the context.
Right. So picture 18th century London for a second. It was a city literally exploding in population. From 1700 to 1740. The population of England and Wales was pretty steady at about 6 million.
Yeah, but then it just shoots up.
Right. After 1740, it skyrockets. The Industrial Revolution is displacing massive amounts of the working class, so London becomes super overcrowded, rife with crushing poverty, and honestly completely flooded with cheap gin.
Oh, the gin craze was very real. And that rapid urbanization, without any kind of social safety net, it created an unprecedented surge in petty crime.
I can imagine.
People were flocking to the city looking for factory work, but there just wasn't enough to go around. Actually, by 1784, a French observer noted that from sunset to dawn, the areas 20 miles around London practically belonged to highwaymen and footpads.
Just totally lawless.
Pretty much, yeah.
So Britain's response to this crime wave was, well, terrifying. They instituted something called the Bloody Code. By the 1770s, there were 222 crimes punishable by death.
222.
Yeah. And we aren't just talking about murder or treason here. You could literally be executed for cutting down a tree in a nobleman's park or stealing a rabbit from a warren.
Which is exactly where the legal system just broke down. Juries simply refused to convict people.
Because it was too harsh.
Exactly. I mean, a judge or a jury would look at a starving 10-year-old who stole a loaf of bread or a rabbit, and they wouldn't send that child to the gallows. It was too horrific even for them.
Right, of course.
The wealthy elites, they wanted laws that terrified the poor into obedience to protect their aristocratic property, but they couldn't actually stomach the bloodbath required to enforce those laws.
So the government needed a supposedly humane alternative, right? Which became transportation.
Yes.
At first, they were shipping people across the Atlantic. The sources note they sent anywhere from 50,000 to 120,000 convicts to North America.
Mostly to Maryland and Virginia, yeah.
Right, to work in the tobacco fields. But then, obviously, the American Revolution happens. America wins its independence, and they essentially tell Britain, yeah, keep your convicts.
We don't want them anymore.
Exactly. Suddenly, that option is entirely cut off.
Which leads to an absolute logistical nightmare on the River Thames. The onshore prisons are already completely full. So, to house the overflow, the British government starts buying up these old, rotting warships left over from the 7 Years' War.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they strip their masts, moor them in the river, and use them as makeshift floating prisons, which were known as hulks.
The conditions in those hulks were supposedly just unimaginable. Disease, malnutrition, zero sanitation.
Horrific. Just horrific.
It makes me think of the British penal system at that time, like a clogged plumbing system. You have this massive buildup of societal pressure caused by poverty and the Industrial Revolution.
Right, that pressure is just building.
Yeah, and for decades, the American pipe acted as the release valve. But when the American Revolution capped that pipe, the pressure just built and built inside those rotting hulks on the Thames. The government urgently needed a massive new release valve.
That is a perfect way to look at it. The
Hmm.
system was basically about to burst. But what's fascinating here is how the pursuit of this supposedly humane judicial punishment—
Transportation instead of execution, right?
exactly, how that inadvertently birthed a massive geopolitical colonial strategy. Because James Cook had mapped the east coast of New Holland back in 1770. By 1786, Britain isn't just looking for a new prison.
They're looking at the map.
Yeah, they are actively seeking to preempt the French colonial empire from expanding into the Pacific. Dropping a penal colony in Australia solves their domestic prison crisis, empties the hulks, and simultaneously plants a strategic flag against the French.
So they turn the valve. In 1787, the first fleet set sail. 11 ships, carrying hundreds of convicts, Marines, and officials, all under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip.
And it was quite the voyage.
I bet. But opening that release valve wasn't just a simple logistical fix, was it?
Yeah.
You are dropping thousands of urban dwellers onto a remote continent they know absolutely nothing about.
No, it was disaster waiting to happen.
Right. They initially arrive at Botany Bay in January 1788, but the environment is entirely unsuitable. The soil's too damp, there's no fresh water, and the harbor is way too shallow to protect the ships.
Yeah, they immediately realize they cannot survive there, so they pack up, sail a few leagues north, and find Port Jackson. Captain Phillip famously described it as one of the finest harbors in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, they anchor in a spot they named Sydney Cove on January 26, 1788, which is the date now marked as Australia Day.
But the reality of arrival was still incredibly grim, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We are talking immediate starvation.
Absolute desperation.
They only brought enough food to last until they could start farming. But here is the critical flaw in their plan. They didn't bring enough skilled farmers.
Right.
You have a population of like pickpockets and urban laborers trying to cultivate alien soil with the wrong tools.
And it just doesn't work. The second fleet, arriving in 1790, was supposed to bring relief, but it was an absolute disaster. The private contractors running those ships starved the convicts just to save money.
That's horrible.
So when they arrived, they basically just dumped hundreds of sick and dying people onto the shore. It pushed the fragile colony right to the brink of collapse.
And as the decades passed and the system expanded, the sources say it fractured into different colonies with vastly varying degrees of brutality. Like, if you were a repeat offender, you might be sent to Macquarie Harbor on the west coast of Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania.
Oh, Macquarie Harbor. It was specifically designed to be an inescapable nightmare.
Escaping into the Tasmanian wilderness sounds like a terrible idea even today, let alone back then.
It was virtually impossible. The convicts there, they logged Huon pine for shipbuilding, standing waist-deep in freezing water for hours at a time.
Yeah, miserable.
And they were subjected to relentless corporal punishment. The fugitives who tried to run either drowned, starved in the dense bush, or in documented cases like Alexander Pierce, they literally turned to cannibalism to survive the trek.
Wait, hold on. I'm struggling with this leap. If the initial goal, as you mentioned earlier, was for lawmakers to provide a humane alternative to the gallows under the Bloody Code, how on earth is sending people to starve in Sydney Cove or driving them to resort to cannibalism in a brutal Tasmanian logging camp actually a step up? That doesn't sound humane at all. It just sounds like a slower, crueler death sentence.
You're completely right, and that is the ultimate paradox of the entire endeavor. You have to remember, the brutality wasn't a glitch in the administration. For the officials back in London, it was a necessary feature.
Because they wanted it to be scary.
Exactly. The entire system relied on the threat of transportation being a terrifying deterrent to the poor back home. But the administration of that deterrence locally in Australia is where the legal mechanics actually get incredibly intricate. I could honestly talk about this all day, but let's look at Governor Richard Bourke in New South Wales in the 1830s.
He was the one who tried to rein in the violence, right?
He was. He was appalled by the completely unregulated punishments. Because before Bourke, an employer could essentially have a convict flogged half to death just for looking at them the wrong way. There was literally no limit.
That's insane.
Right. So Bourke passes the Magistrates Act, which legally caps the sentence a magistrate could pass to 50 lashes.
I mean, 50 lashes with a cat o' nine tails still sounds like it would take the flesh right off your back.
Oh, it absolutely would. It was horrific. But you have to view it in the context of the era. Furious employers actually petitioned the Crown against Bourke.
Seriously, over 50 lashes?
Yeah. They were terrified that limiting the beatings meant losing their absolute control over their free labor force. But Bork holds firm, and this ties perfectly into the ticket of leave system, which is honestly a masterclass in bureaucratic behavioral control.
How did that work in practice?
So it was this highly structured incentive program. If a convict behaved, they weren't just spared the lash, they were granted a ticket of leave. This specific legal document gave them the right to work for their own wages, choose their employer, and even acquire property long before their actual sentence expired.
Oh, wow. So they got some freedom back.
Exactly. At the end of a 7-year sentence, they received a certificate of freedom. So suddenly, a former pickpocket from the London slums could serve on a jury. They could own a business. They could become landowners.
So it was this bizarre, unprecedented mix of horrific physical punishment combined with a genuine, legally binding pathway to social mobility, something that simply did not exist for the working class in Britain.
Exactly. And the authorities never stopped experimenting with the mechanics of punishment either. Over in Port Arthur in Tasmania, they eventually replaced the physical brutality of the lash with a model prison system.
Okay, what does that mean?
They moved away from flogging and adopted solitary confinement as their primary tool.
Solitary confinement wasn't just being left alone in a room, though, was it?
No, it was absolute engineered sensory deprivation. It was psychological warfare designed to break the convict's mind rather than their body. Complete silence was enforced.
Wow.
In the chapel, convicts were placed in separate wooden stalls so they could only see the preacher, not each other.
That's incredibly isolating.
Oh, it gets worse. When they were moved around the prison, they were forced to wear masks with small eye slits so they couldn't even make visual contact with their fellow prisoners.
Masks. It's chilling to think about the level of administration that went into that kind of psychological destruction.
It really is.
But, when you picture the people enduring this, the people subjected to the masks or the logging camps or surviving the wilderness, it's so easy to picture a homogenous group of hardened, violent murderers.
Oh, for sure. That's the stereotype.
Right. But looking at the actual demographics from our sources completely shatters that stereotype.
Completely. Between 1788 and 1868, about 162,000 convicts were transported, and a staggering 80% of them were thieves.
Just thieves.
Yeah, mostly petty thieves driven by the poverty we discussed earlier.
And about 1 in 7 were women, roughly 24,000 women. The sources note that the gender imbalance was massive, so for protection and basic survival, many of these women quickly attached themselves to male officers or convicts upon arrival.
It was purely about survival.
Exactly. And there's a massive historical myth here to bust for you.
Yeah.
Although they were routinely referred to in historical texts as courtesans or women of loose morals, the official records show that not a single woman was actually transported for prostitution.
Which is wild because it's such a pervasive myth.
Right. It simply wasn't a transportable offense under British law.
The diversity of the convicts is truly remarkable. Approximately 3,600 of them were political prisoners. These were people who had technically committed no standard criminal offense at all, but were swept up in waves of political unrest.
We're talking about Irish rebels fighting against British rule, Luddites protesting the mechanization of their jobs, and the toll puddle martyrs who were arrested simply for trying to form an early trade union.
Exactly.
The text specifically highlights black convicts as well, many of whom were enslaved people transported explicitly for resisting their enslavement, or, as punishment for speaking out against the British Empire across its colonies.
And the individual stories of survival and reinvention are just extraordinary. Consider William Buckley, for example. He was transported, managed to escape into the bush in Victoria in 1803, and ended up living with the local Wathaurong Aboriginal people.
Oh.
He integrated completely into their society, learned their language, and lived with them for 32 years before finally making contact with new European settlers.
32 years. That's incredible. Or what about William Cuffey? He was a prominent black London chartist and a tailor. He was betrayed by a government spy in London, convicted of preparing acts of arson for an armed uprising, and sentenced to 21 years.
A huge sentence.
Yeah, but he gets to Australia, and he doesn't just quietly serve his time. He becomes a major, prominent leader in the early Australian labor movement.
They just kept fighting. And then there is the incredible case of Samuel Speed, which really brings us back to our opening scenario. He is believed to be the last surviving transported convict. He lived until 1938.
Think about the sheer scale of that for a second. 1938. There were airplanes and radios, And this man was a living relic of the transportation era.
It's hard to wrap your head around. He was born in Birmingham and transported to Western Australia in 1866. But what is truly revealing is the mechanism of his crime. In 1863, Samuel Speed was homeless and starving. He deliberately set a haystack on fire for the express purpose of getting arrested.
Just to get caught.
Yes, just so he could obtain shelter and a guaranteed meal in a prison cell.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
If you think about Samuel Speed's choice, it is essentially a tragic historical life hack.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. Just imagine how exceptionally dire the poverty in Victorian England must have been if the prospect of getting shipped in chains to a penal colony on the other side of the globe was actively viewed as an upgrade.
Yeah.
He wanted a roof over his head, even if he had to cross an ocean in the hull of a prison ship to get it.
This raises an important question for us to consider regarding how societies evolve, because how did these incredibly diverse backgrounds, from desperate people setting haystacks on fire to highly organized political dissidents and early union organizers like Cafe, actually seed the nation that followed?
That's a great point.
Because they didn't just serve their time and disappear. These were people inherently skeptical of authority. They became the intense labor force and the political agitators of early Australia.
Wait, if these convicts and free settlers were successfully building out the infrastructure, roads, bridges, entire functioning communities, how did the system finally end? Because usually, if an economic system is working for the empire, they don't just shut it down out of the goodness of their heart.
No, definitely not. It became a massive economic and social battle. By the 1830s, free settlers were pushing back hard.
Why was that?
Well, you had newspaper owners and thousands of free laborers arriving who absolutely hated the economic competition of convict labor. It drove wages way down.
Of course.
They viewed the entire system as what they explicitly called the hated stain of convictism on their developing, respectable society. They wanted it gone.
But I imagine the wealthy landowners felt very differently.
Oh, entirely. Wealthy landowners like the prominent squatter Benjamin Boyd actively lobbied to keep transportation going because it provided them with an endless pipeline of cheap, indentured labor.
They just wanted the free workforce.
Exactly. They wanted to use transported convicts from Van Diemen's Land as shepherds in New South Wales to maximize their profits. It was pure economic self-interest clashing with a growing middle class that wanted social respectability.
But the anti-transportation movement eventually won out, right?
Yes, it did.
The system ended progressively across the continent. New South Wales saw its last convicts in 1850. Tasmania ended transportation in 1853. And finally, Western Australia, which, remarkably, had actually petitioned Britain to send convicts to help with severe labor shortages for their infrastructure.
Yeah, they asked for them.
Right. They received their final ship, the Hougoumont, in January 1868.
And the long-term cultural legacy of that 80-year period is profound. For decades afterward, there was a deep, pervasive shame associated with the convict era.
The hated stain.
Yes. Having a convict ancestor was a source of intense cultural cringe. Families would actively hide their genealogy. They would literally tear pages out of family Bibles to obscure their roots.
That's so sad. But then it completely flips in the 20th century. Today, an estimated 4 million Australians are descendants of these convicts, and it is now considered a point of immense pride. It is almost a badge of honor to trace your lineage back to a First Fleeter or a transported Irish rebel.
It really is. You also see this legacy heavily imprinted on global culture and literature. Perhaps the most famous convict in all of fiction is Abel Magwitch from Charles Dickens' 1861 novel Great Expectations.
Oh, of course.
And there's Marcus Clarke's famous Australian novel For the Term of His Natural Life, which depicted the horrors of Macquarie Harbour. And during the silent film era, convicts were massively popular subjects.
Really, silent films.
Yeah. The 1908 film adaptation of Marcus Clarke's novel was shot on location at Port Arthur with a budget of £7,000, which was astronomically expensive for the time.
Wow. So what does this all mean? I want you to really reflect on the psychological whiplash of an entire society here. How does a history that was once a source of the deepest national shame, the literal hated stain that people tried to erase from their family trees, transform over a century into a celebrated badge of honor and a core pillar of cultural identity?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is the ultimate story of unintended consequences and human resilience. The British government tried to solve a domestic poverty crisis by throwing 162,000 human beings they deemed undesirable to the other side of the world.
And those outcasts literally built the infrastructure of the continent.
Exactly. Places like the Hyde Park Barracks or the Fremantle Prison, built brick by their hands, are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They turn human refuse into the founding mythology of a modern, thriving nation.
It really is a massive scale to wrap your head around. From the overflowing, disease-ridden hulks on the River Thames to the psychological warfare of Port Arthur, right up to the final voyage the Hougoumont in 1868.
It's quite the a story that proves conclusively that people are not solely defined by the worst label their society applies to them, or, the worst moment of their lives. Something to really think about.